My name is Justin Ellis. I'm the Executive Director of Fuel for Truth, joined here today by our Chairman, Ron Wasserman. And we like to use this webinar that we try to hold on a monthly basis to really bring our community together, bring other stakeholders who certainly care about Israel, would like to learn more about it, have the opportunity to engage, in which we talk about some of the major issues going on, things that are prevalent certainly in the media, but certainly things that are going on in Israel that may not be discussed otherwise. And most importantly, with this community, we actually want to hear from you. That Ron and I certainly have ideas of what's important and what we'd like to discuss, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure your concerns are being addressed and that what you are thinking about is offered as part of this conversation to give you the opportunity to help voice those ideas and certainly to create more of a discussion surrounding it. For those of you who are not as familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit that focuses on equipping individuals with the knowledge, the tools, and the confidence to have civil and productive conversations about Israel, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and most uniquely in 2021, how do you facilitate civil, productive, and repeated engagement with someone if and when their understanding of reality and these issues are not the same as your own? That's very much what we specialize in. We do this primarily through our signature bootcamp program, which is for young professionals ages 22 to 40. We also hold different webinars, such as the one that we're all participating in today, as well as we offer separate workshops for different community groups, synagogue meetings, as well as high school and college students. So this really allows us to expand and maximize our footprint to really engage with the wider Jewish community, the pro-Israel community, and to ensure that everyone is getting the education, the empowerment, and the confidence they so desire. So to kick things off with Israel update today, Ron, I want to start off with what we were talking about as far as the Israel's COVID vaccine. There are a lot of different angles in which this is being discussed. Some are more recent as far as what happened on Saturday Night Live this past weekend. Some relates to the Palestinians. Some relates to how Israel was able to obtain large doses of Pfizer vaccine up front when much of the world is still scrambling to gain their doses. So Ron, just to start off, can we talk a little bit about sort of why and how Israel was selected to gain all these vaccines and what it's meant as far as the inoculation process of what we're all going through now?
Israel is a fascinating case study when it comes to the pandemic and the vaccination. Israel made a decision, which some people questioned, to overpay for the vaccine up front. So they paid a premium to get all these doses immediately, and they had the foresight to realize, you know what, we can overpay for the vaccine now, and this will allow us to open up our economy even sooner. And in the end, when we look back on it, it becomes almost a rounding error when it comes to the premium they ended up paying to get all these doses so early. Another fascinating aspect about it is that Israel agreed to almost be a clinical trial. Right? So these vaccines were tested in, certain, under certain regulations and scenarios and went through the process. But now you have a country vaccinating its population. And Israel is now obligated to aggregate all kinds of data, report back to Pfizer, Moderna, and Planet Earth, essentially, to let them know, what really is going on with this vaccination. Can it be transmitted once you get it? We heard, yes, Israel, it seems that what might end up being the case is that, no, you don't transmit it once you have the vaccine. So there's all kinds of things that will play out over the next few months as Israel continues to vaccinate its entire population. When the dust settles, certainly a brilliant move to pay whatever it cost to make sure that you had enough doses right out of the gate to vaccinate your entire population. So,
yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot that we're going to
watch the data coming out over the next few months as they continue to vaccinate everybody.
Sure. And yeah, it's not even just the actual vaccination itself, but also the rollout of reopening the economy, reopening the society. Whether that's over there or here, we're going to learn what that's going to be like on a very trial and error basis. And some things are going to work well, some things are not going to work well. Israel, given sort of the startup culture, certainly the medical infrastructure that it has through its healthcare system, all of this, like you said, made it an optimal environment for this type of testing, not to mention such a small population compared to whether it's the United States or most European countries. To kind of take that further, to introduce, what I alluded to before, Sure, many of you are familiar, or at least heard about it on social media or from someone you're friends with or family, that this past weekend on Saturday Night Live, there was a joke on their weekend update section that many people didn't find so funny. And that was effectively insinuation that Israel was only vaccinating Jews, and whether that could have been interpreted as anti-Semitism, whether that was relating to Jewish citizens of Israel versus the Palestinians versus Israeli nationals. It opened the door for all these different interpretations of what was this joke trying to say, who was it directed toward, and as we all know, because of how this conflict and this country is politicized so often, every little camp was then defending their point of view and certainly making themselves very vocal about what this meant to them. To clarify some of the misconceptions surrounding whether it was the joke itself, but also just the concept of Israel only treating Jews, that is simply not the case. We have enough evidence to see that with the vaccine rollout, this is for Israeli nationals within Israel's borders. That is irrespective of what demographic sector you come from, whether you are Arab, Christian, Druze, Circassian, or anything else. Ron, can you add your 2 cents on what you had seen about that type of rollout and certainly how different communities were receiving the vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'd like to diverge for 1 minute, because I think you can lump in the criticism of Israel. Israel, no matter what she does well or how well she does it, the world will only look at the negative. I mean, look at apartheid. Israel is a country where Palestinians thrive, they're free. You couldn't really name an apartheid law in the sovereign state of Israel. When you talk about the West Bank, we know we have 2 different governments for 2 different people. I bring this up because we should be looking at how Israel treats the Palestinians in relation to what the Syrians have done, what the Lebanese do on a daily basis, what Kuwait was guilty of in the 90s. So you take something that's positive and a negative spin with apartheid. Genocide. Israel's been committing genocide for decades. There's no data, there's no fact or reality that can back that up. Israel, when it comes to warfare, its code of ethics, in engaging in any kind of war, when it comes to minimizing civilian casualties, there's no one better on earth, and there's data there to back that up. It's undebatable. So they take a positive and spin a negative, that Israel targets innocent civilians, Israel's committing genocide, Israel's trying to, so on and so forth. And we can go down with all these accusations down the line. And now COVID is another one. Here they are rolling it out, and now Israel's being accused of not doing anything for the Palestinian Authority. So let's take a moment to review that. The Palestinians in the early 90s negotiated, agreed to, and are a party to and signed the Oslo Accords. And as part of that agreement, they're in charge of their own healthcare system. That was by their own negotiations, their own choosing. It's their responsibility. They have made the decision to not cooperate with Israel, which should come as no surprise to anyone who understands what's going on there. They decided to put their lot in with the WHO and the Russians. So Israel has openly tried to cooperate. We've seen many articles. We've seen politicians say we're waiting for a phone call. Palestinians aren't interested in cooperating with Israel. We know that the UAE sent in some vaccines and some aid, but it was going via Israel. So the Palestinians rejected it. Anything that the Jews touch, they want no part of. It's more advantageous for them to just point the finger at Israel and they know that the community, the West at large, will not hold them responsible. So a lot of the issues that the Palestinians are having are due to their own leadership. The PA has completely cut off cooperation with Israel. They have quietly shared vaccines. They've opened up their hospitals to Palestinian COVID patients. But this idea that Israel's responsible for vaccinating the Palestinians living in the West Bank is absurd. It's not their responsibility. It's the legal obligation of the Palestinian Authority. And, a lot of people want to throw the Fourth Convention, the Fourth Convention, that they're responsible as the occupying power. And again, that's just not true. That's a discussion for another time. But Israel's not occupying Ramallah, Jenin, Shem, Hebron, and these other places. They are subject to the rule and law of the Palestinian Authority. If your issue is that the Palestinians are not getting vaccinated and that rollout isn't going well, we need to be putting pressure and looking at what can the Palestinian Authority do better to vaccinate their population. Let's take a second to look at the Arab Israelis. So you and I were talking about this over the last few days. The most accurate data that I can find seems to be that somewhere around 50 to 60% of Arab Israelis, Palestinians living in Israel, citizens of Israel, have been vaccinated over the age of 65. So there's room for improvement there. But remember what Israel's also dealing with. Conspiracy theorists. You know, there are people within that, not only the Arab Israeli population, but certainly the Jewish population, Orthodox population as well, who conspiracy theories, anti-vaxxers, and we have that here. So you have that lot that you have to deal with. But something unique to the Arab Israelis is their hatred for the Jewish state. Anything that Israel touches, anything the Jews are involved in, they're not interested in. So Israel has got to figure out a way to try and overcome both of those. One thing they're really trying to do is have the leaders of those communities, whether it's the Haredim or the Palestinians, doctors within the community, Palestinian doctors, getting the vaccine, showing their community that, hey, it's good for me, I'm doing it, to hopefully try and break down that barrier to get that number up. So again, it's organized against Israel, and this is nothing new. Israel does something good. That's not the story we're going to hear. That's not the reality or the narrative that will get reported. They'll find something negative, and again, the COVID vaccine with the Palestinians living in the West Bank is nothing new.
Yeah, one thing I'm really glad you brought up was the context of the Oslo Accords. I think you and I have discussed this on our own time, and I'm sure everyone can relate in their own way that, not only within the scope of history, but especially in today's world, everyone has 15-second attention spans. You only remember something for so long. Most people have no idea that Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, withdrew from southern Lebanon in 2000, obviously withdrew from areas of the West Bank that became Area A and obviously B as well because of the Oslo Accords. But one thing I want to throw in here is that, to kind of take a step back here, that when we're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with a once, and hopefully only once in a century type of incident that has paralyzed, crippled, and overwhelmed every country on this planet, from the most advanced to the most primitive and everything in between. And it must be said that the structures that our global society had developed to deal with public health issues were not there to address this. That even if you want to point out, or if you're of the view that Israel should have done this, could have done that, that's all fine and well. But understand this is part of a larger global problem that every country has failed miserably at one way or another, no matter their geopolitical situation. And I wish that would become more of the conversation about this. Certainly about making sure people are getting the healthcare, getting the vaccines as quickly as possible. And like you said, as a way to obviously lift people up, to make this more of a positive, not just in terms of spin, but really to say that we are dealing with a collective crisis. And therefore, we need to actually focus on ways to fix it rather than every group trying to hop on the bandwagon to score political points or to advance their own ideological agendas and take advantage of the situation. So that's what I wish I would see more from most people. And I'm glad you mentioned that within the context of Oslo.
You bring up a good point. I'd just add one more thing to that. I spoke to a client of mine in France yesterday and in Toronto, Canada. And I asked him, how's the vaccine? And to your point, it's an absolute tire fire in France. It's a mess. They're not making any headway. And you're right. You look around the world, it's not only in some of these places where you might expect that, it's happening in places where you would be shocked to hear that they can't get it together. They can't roll it out. They can't get the doses. They can't execute a proper vaccination program. This is happening in France and Canada, who I would have thought that at least Canada might be running circles around us in a vaccination program, but that is not the case.
Yeah, no, it's a sad and unfortunate situation. Hopefully, obviously now in this year, it gets a little better for everyone. Before we kind of shift gears to the next topic, one thing I forgot to mention in the beginning, obviously we want to hear from you guys throughout if you have any questions, any thoughts. So please use the Q&A function, use the chat box, and toward the end, even if you want to speak up verbally, through the camera, by all means, please do so. To kind of go forward, we are now obviously in a new era of US politics. There's a new presidential administration, and like every turnover, When it comes to a new occupant of the White House, that comes with new policies, both domestic and foreign. When it comes to foreign policy, one major shift from President Trump from President Obama was how it was addressing Middle East affairs, but in particular the JCPOA, also known as the Iran deal. This was something that the Trump administration walked away from, was not party to anymore. And now there are conversations within the Biden administration, whether it's members of the quartet or the group that's behind the JCPOA, to re-engage with Iran and to see what can either be salvaged from the existing agreement or forming a new one. Ron, one thing I wanted to ask of you, and certainly it's been a conversation many of us have had before, is given the change in administration from one that, at least in perception, and some people are entitled to their opinion one way or another, was very Israel friendly, was very friendly to the interests of Israel and its Arab partners through the Abraham Accords, to one that now might be a little more hostile, reserved. Are we seeing a type of recalculation or reset when it comes to the Biden foreign policy as it pertains to Israel and the JCPOA in particular?
Yes, there's no doubt about it. I've been on record as stating that we knew that there was going to be an attempt to re-enter the JCPOA. It was always my hope that they would do it from a position of strength and understand that the deal that was negotiated under the Obama administration was flawed, didn't accomplish the goal that Obama and his team stated, which was to end, this is their own words, to dismantle and end the nuclear program in Iran, which obviously the deal didn't do. It was a good deal if your goal was to freeze it, stall it out, stop it temporarily. This deal did that, and it did it very well. But that wasn't the goal. And unfortunately, it seems as if, and time will tell, that the Biden administration doesn't seem interested in strengthening the deal, renegotiating it. It seems, and we have word and deed, and we see the word, we'll soon see what deeds take place, but that they want to re-enter the agreement. I think something interesting that has come up over the past week is the Europeans. Even the Europeans are saying, hey, we shouldn't re-enter that deal. We should negotiate a better deal. And the fact that the Europeans are saying that is telling. So yeah, we're gonna have a reset here. The Obama's not in office, but it is Biden, and it's all the same players behind the scenes that were running foreign policy. And it was always my hope that, they tried something. People like me thought it was a little insane and it wouldn't work, and it didn't. But you would like to think that cooler heads would prevail and say, hey, this didn't work first time around, so let's try it different. We don't have to abandon maybe our thesis here, but let's try and do it in a different way. And I'm not so sure anymore, unfortunately, that that's going to happen. So when it comes to the JCPOA, it looks like that's starting to heat up. And from what we can see right now is that, yeah, there will be an attempt to re-enter the deal. I mean, I think the most fatal flaw that was made in the first deal was this assumption by Obama and his whole team that if we gave Iran all these gifts, all these nuggets, that they would come around. They would see that there's a benefit, which is true. There would be a huge benefit for Iran to enter back into the good graces of planet Earth. As you know, I live in Great Neck. Many Persians are my friends. I break bread with them. I play tennis with them. That's some of my closest friends. I think that's always what's the tragedy of what's going on in Iran now, is that how unbelievable the people living in Iran now are that the world really doesn't know. And the JCPOA should really be to free those people and should benefit them. I don't see that happening anytime soon. The people will suffer. And again, it's really unbelievable, even as I say it, that there was this assumption and conviction that Iran was just going to come around if we gave them a few $1 billion and, lifted sanctions and gave them free reign to do whatever they wanted in the region, that they wouldn't do all these, engage in these nefarious activities and would come around and be a good sport. And it's insane that somebody at that level would think that, but that was honestly driving a lot of policy. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays off. And in general, I think you'll see the same, like under the Obama administration for 8 years, don't want to get involved, don't want to be a policeman, don't have a problem creating vacuums in certain places and pulling out. I think we'll see a hybrid of that kind of policy towards Israel, the region, and probably other places going forward.
To start using questions, because we have some audience questions here in the chat. Jeremy's asking that he had thought Tony Blinken, who's Secretary of State, had made statements indicating that we are far from re-entry without changing the deal. Is that not the case?
Listen, all signs are pointing to, again, word and deed. You know, I meet with a lot of politicians. I'm not so sure that, you know, they're going to be negotiating for a position of strength. Jeremy, I really hope that's the case. Again, I've been on record the whole time. I feel less confident about that. I felt that that's what was going to happen when we learned that Biden had won the election. I am less confident than I was maybe a month ago that that's the line that they're going to toe. I feel that they're going to want a deal at all costs. I think this will be, again, a signature foreign policy achievement for Biden, and they're going to want it at all costs. And I fear that they will enter into a very similar deal as last time. I don't see this administration negotiating a deal that will end Iran's nuclear program and take a tough line. Remember, you have to have the threat of force and sanctions on the table. We're talking about the Middle East, and I'm not advocating for war in any case. The Iranians are never going to go to war. Look at what Israel has done to Iran over the last decade. They're obliterating them in Syria. They're blowing up sites in Iran. They took out their chief nuclear scientist in daylight in one of the most fancy neighborhoods in Iran with essentially zero repercussions. They have no army. They don't have a threat. Their threat is their terror. You know, they are the #1 state sponsor of terror on planet Earth. So they do have proxies and they are dangerous, but it's clear that Iran has no appetite for war. We should not forget that we achieved what the JCPOA did in 2003 and 2013 without even being in a negotiation. In 2003, the supreme leader was convinced that Bush was going to invade Iran instead of Iraq, and that was out on the table. And just the thought of that led to the Iranians freezing their program. And then in 2013, when Obama finally came around on the sanctions and started crushing them, to his credit, crushing them with sanctions, they froze again. So we actually achieved what the JCPOA did temporarily in 2003 and 2013.
Another question here we have from Joseph. Did the Trump administration have any positive effect on Iran? To add to that, did Iran reduce its nuclear capabilities under that administration? Was anyone hurt except the Iranian people? How do we pressure the Biden administration to get a good deal?
It's a good point. No, I don't believe the Iranian people got any better. Again, the problem with sanctions, which I am for, but it's a double-edged sword. It's a good question, Joe. Who are you ultimately hurting? The people. Regime will find ways in the black market to line their pockets and continue supporting terror groups, but it put Iran in a weaker condition, no doubt. And I think if that administration had another 4 years and decided and could actually engage, they'd be in an even mightier position than ever before. But that is not the case. So I forget the first part, but did the Iranian people benefit under the Trump administration? Absolutely not. You know, Trump was even more aggressive with sanctions. And again, unfortunately, those go to hurt the people that we should be trying to help, which is the Iranian people.
Right. And like you said, that is one of the drawbacks of sanctions, not only in terms of, certainly its impact on different parties that you actually don't want to negatively impact, but also at the end of the day, when the Iranian people are on the receiving end of this, their thought isn't, oh, the government's so bad, let's overthrow them. It's that the United States, other countries are sanctioning us and making our lives miserable.
They're crushing us.
The U.S. becomes the bad guy in their minds, which is obviously exactly what the U.S. wants.
Yep. You have another question here, Justin?
Yeah, Lissa has a question regarding the vaccine.
Yeah, so regarding the
Liz.
regarding the vaccine, and to your point of like countries around the world struggling with it, I think what I've heard from maybe more liberal people in my life is that Israel is kind of messing up when it comes to their Arab population within the country, their citizens. So it's kind of like this focused failure in a way. So that's it basically.
Got it. So listen, the data shows that I believe 75% or more of Israel's population over the age of 65 has been vaccinated. And if you
Mhm.
Arab Israelis, they're about 20% below that. So I think they're being a little bit extreme, but there's some truth there. Like we stated in the beginning, like Israel can do better, but you have to understand what Israel's dealing with. Not that they're ignoring them. Like there is a problem in that community. They're very hostile to the state in which they live. And because Israel is giving the vaccine, automatically you have a certain percentage of the population that is just not going to take it. Look at the example in East Jerusalem. You know, you have tens of thousands, if not 100,000 Palestinians who can become citizens of Israel and have everything to gain from that. But they refuse to become citizens because, you know, getting involved with the Zionist state and the Jews and, you know, maybe what would happen to them in their community. You know, it's a problem that doesn't just resonate when it comes to getting vaccinated. It's a problem in all kinds of areas of Israeli society when it comes to the Palestinians. So
Mhm.
I again, from your comment there, it seems like, you know, they're probably being a little bit more extreme in their defense. Can Israel do more? Can Israel do a little bit better? Sure, that will always be the case. But to make the case that Israel is ignoring its Arab Israel, no, they're actually putting in effort, trying to get, like I said earlier, they're trying to get doctors, leaders in the community vaccinated to send the message back into their own communities that, hey guys, this is free, it's available to you, you should be coming to get it.
Mhm. And so I actually,
Of a lot of the times these Israelis and Arabs who want it are getting it. They're going to Arab towns and cities because they're not going to get their vaccine. So at the end of the day, there are all these extra doses. So the people who actually do want it are rushing to these places to get in line to try and, even without the appointment, to try and get the dose at the end of the day, because in these Arab towns, they're not, for a few different reasons, they're not showing up to get vaccinated.
Mhm. And on the Instagram post that I saw from a friend of mine, I think she actually used the word genocide. And so that's why I really wanted to engage her in this. And I'm just, I guess, more broadly speaking, are there any outlets or websites where you go for a sort of non-biased or take on what's going on in Israel, where you can kind of just get the facts in the way that you're describing?
And it's really hard. It's really hard. Even if you go to a think tank, you know, who is the think tank funded by? Is it funded by wealthy right wing or conservative, left wing? Because then you'll see they'll start to lean that way. I find the Times of Israel to be kind of right down the center when it comes to news. You know, Haaretz, I would used to say is left, but that's not even true. I mean, they've gone way off the deep end on the left side of the political spectrum. Ynet leans a little right. It's hard. So actually, I cannot tell you that this is the website you go. This right in the, you know, this is going to be the truth. Take it to your grave. If you find that, I would actually be interested. I think the best thing you can do is try and take all sides. And then you have enough of a background, Alyssa, I think, with your engagement coming through Fuel for Truth, where you can kind of find out where it lands. Go read what the people on the left and far left are saying in Israel or, you know, wherever. Then go to the right, try and find the center, and you should be able to try and piece together where the narrative should be.
Cool. Thank you.
Alyssa, to add to your initial question as far as the vaccine and sort of how Arabs may or may not be sort of discriminated against in that regard due to availability or the rollout, you know, one thing that's important to keep in mind, and this is on a particular level when it comes to Israel, but also a universal level around the world. When it comes to societal infrastructure, whether we're dealing with education, civil services, sewage collection, anything and everything in between, minorities typically get the short end of the stick everywhere. And in Israel, it's not just the Arab community. We're dealing with Olim from the former Soviet Union, Ethiopians, Haredim, all of them deal with these problems. And it is not remotely surprising that it is also extended to a vaccine rollout that is unprecedented as well. So that is something that I would keep in consideration, not only for yourself, but for these conversations, and certainly not as a way to you know, let Israel like off the hook for any shortcomings, but to say like this makes sense given the imperfect nature of how societies are structured and how certain populations deal with the governments that they live under. And as Ron mentioned before, this is not exclusively an Arab problem. If you look at the majority of conversations about Israel's failure when it comes to either lockdowns, vaccine rollouts, or even protests, all the pictures you'll see on every newspaper cover, every magazine is Haredim, is ultra-Orthodox protests, not Arabs. So keep in mind that it's not just one minority group, the non-Jewish one, that is dealing with these issues or is causing a complication with how we get past where we currently are.
The Haredi may be more of a problem and be larger in number when it comes to getting Israel vaccinated than the Arab Israelis. There's probably a bigger problem there. I mean, there are articles out there that in Bnei Brak, they're offering children to try and get them to get vaccinated. So, you know, they're trying. It's just not easy what they're going to be dealing with some of those communities inside Israel.
I see Galit has her hand up. It's great to see you. It's been way too long.
Hi, I know. How are you?
Good.
I have two questions regarding the vaccine. The first one, Ron, if you could explain a little bit more about the UAE giving the vaccines to Palestinians through Israel, because all the headlines I read was Israel blocks vaccines to Palestine, blah, blah, blah. Can you explain more? And the second question was regarding the Haredim. How would you recommend for us as individuals to defend that? Because me as a doctor, pro-vaccine, pro even quarantine sometimes, it's hard not to criticize this Jewish population not wanting to get vaccinated and, you know, having all these parties and stuff. How would you recommend for us to tackle that subject?
Listen, tackling that subject, we should always be honest about it, Galit. Let's start with the Haredim. Like, you know, you need their rabbis. They, you know, you have to understand who you're dealing with, like what we talk about in Fuel for Truth. Know who you're talking to. You're talking to someone who just hates Jews, someone who's in the middle. You know, you got to determine that. And with the Haredim, you have to understand who you're talking to. These are the most faithful people, arguably, on earth. So you have to understand their whole world in the lens in which they view the world in their daily lives. The only way I believe that we can make headways there is through the rabbis. If the rabbis aren't going to, and even then, that's not going to convince everybody, but it has to start there. Whatever sect of orthodoxy, and you know, there's all the Babov and this and that, you got to find the leaders within these sects, and they're the ones who I believe can be most effective in getting the Haredim vaccinated. And we talk about this in Fuel for Truth as well. We shouldn't always be making excuses. We shouldn't make excuses for some of these Orthodox guys who are being crazy and saying the vaccine does all kinds of things that it doesn't. We need to be honest with ourselves and our own people. So we shouldn't be making up excuses, and we shouldn't be hesitant to criticize them if criticism is warranted. And when it comes to not getting vaccinated, you know, we need to hold them to the same standard we would everyone else. And again, I just think that the only way to get through to them is through their own people, similar to what Israel's trying to do with leaders in the Arab Israeli community. Get them to get vaccinated, get them to get on their pulpits, whatever it may be, and tell their people that this is important. We need to do this. We're all in this together. As far as the UAE, I mean, David Harris from the AJC wrote an article about, you know, the Palestinians and the vaccine issue. And it's been widely reported on many different fronts, Belly, that oftentimes people try and help anything that Israel touches, the PA typically rejects. And the problem is, unless Jordan is going to get involved, which is not going to be the case, if you're going to get aid to the Palestinians living in the West Bank under the control of the Palestinian Authority, it's going to have to go through Israel. Is it going to go through Syria? It's going to go through Jordan. It's going to have to go through Israel. And once Israel touches it, that becomes a problem for the PA. So the UAE was trying to help them. They've tried to do in different scenarios over years past aid. And if Israel's going to get involved, then it becomes a problem. It's the same issue with economic development. You know, under the Trump administration, Kushner and Greenblatt were trying to, you know, initiate some economic production, some stimulus, some progression in the West Bank. And the leaders of Saeb Erekat, Abu Mazen, they will not have it. They will not have it. If the US or Israel is going to try and open up an incubator lab or tech something in Israel, in the West Bank, they're not going to accept it until they get their own state. So there's a record really across the board with this rejection from Israel when they try and help out in any capacity. And it's not limited to the vaccine.
Can you repeat the name of the author of the article, please?
You should look up David Harris, by the way, is incredible. You should just Google David Harris, AJC. The articles he puts out are very articulate, thoughtful. He's the kind of guy, when you read the article, you're like, you know, that's what I was thinking. It's like Brett Stevens. That's what I'm thinking. That's how I feel. But I could never write it or speak it the way he does.
Thank
Another
you.
question we have here, and I'll preface this that Fuel for Truth is a proud partner of Jewish National Fund. We have a number of JNF future donors on this call, myself included, as well as one JNF staff member who, given the question, has actually very kindly volunteered to answer it. So one of the questions we have here in the chat from Joe is that there's talk that JNF is funding settlements in the West Bank, and can we shed light on this? Given the fact that we have a JNF employee with us who's kindly volunteered, I would certainly defer to her to answer that.
Thanks, Justin. I'm here not in a professional capacity. I am also a Fuel for Truth alum and was happy to be included today. But since I do work for Jewish National Fund, I will go ahead and address this question. The Jewish National Fund, Jewish National Fund USA, divorced itself from JNF KKL in the 1950s. So the JNF that you're referring to, the posted out in the media as just JNF, is a separate entity. Essentially today we use JNF KKL as a like third party to, for example, plant trees in Israel, which is historically the most significant part of our work, but is now a small portion of what we do. We can't control the media and we can't control what they write. I do wish that they would specify JNF KKL because we're a different organization. And I'm happy to I can share with Justin some literature to that effect. Our CEO, Russell Robinson, did do a really excellent interview last week with I-24 News. They invited him on to speak about the settlements in the West Bank. And he basically said, I can't speak about it because you're asking me about an organization I don't work for. And that really sums it up.
And Joe, I'd like to elaborate. You said, isn't in Israel's best interest to vaccinate everybody? I would argue yes and no. Remember, we have a security barrier, which I am not a fan of, in the West Bank. A lot of the Palestinians living in the West Bank aren't even allowed in Israel. So you could make the case that whether they're vaccinated or not, when it comes to them infecting Israel, other than the workers that come in, it wouldn't have a big effect. But I would even put that to the side. As a human, as a citizen, yes, we should be trying to get everyone vaccinated, but we can't ignore fact and reality, which is no matter what Israel is going to try and do, unless the people who rule over the 2 million Palestinians, which is not Israel, unless they are on board, unless they want to cooperate with Israel, there's nothing Israel can do. But yeah, I would agree it's in the best interests of just humanity that everyone should get vaccinated. Everyone should get vaccinated.
To move us forward to the last thing we have on the agenda, and by all means afterward, we can make this as much of an open conversation as we'd like about anything that's on your mind, is many of you I'm sure know that Israel is about to have its fourth election in 2 years, next month, March 23rd. And there's a lot of questions surrounding it in terms of certainly, will Netanyahu still serve as prime minister based on the results of how many seats Likud gets, certainly what type of coalition configuration he can put together, what type of potential threats does he deal with from the right, which is very different than historically. They're coming more from a left space. So in this case, we're dealing with Gideon Saar's New Hope Party. We're dealing with Naftali Bennett of Yamina. And so we're really kind of seeing an interesting situation that may prove to be different. I'm going to check my or curb my optimism, just given all the evidence we have of what this has been like, and certainly the coalitions that are available. But Ron, if you want to kind of open up, like, what are your thoughts about what this election may look like? Certainly, how, if and how does Bibi survive given his own legal troubles and as well as COVID? And, you know, it's going to be a different election, even though it's still more of the same.
Yeah. Listen, I have a lot of thoughts about it. I don't know how deep I want to dive into it, but it is going to be interesting. There are new parties. The Likud looks different. There are other players in the field, center, right, not so much left. And I don't know if I necessarily see a path. Let's say Bibi wins. Can he put a coalition together with the way things are turning out? I'm not so sure. I'm not there. But as a Jew living in the diaspora and with the current administration in place, at least for the next 4 years, possibly 8, personally, and this is not Fuel for Truth, but this is Ron Wasserman as, you know, a citizen of Earth, I would like to see a new leader. Doesn't mean I'm against Bibi. I think he's a masterclass politician. I know firsthand what a brilliant, intelligent, high IQ individual he is. But I just think the middle class in Israel, of which I have many family members who I'm close with, are better off with a new leader. I believe Jews living in the diaspora are better off with a new leader. And I think as far as the US-Israel relationship will always be strong. It'll always be there. It'll have its ups and downs, but certainly it will be smoother and there'll be less friction without a Bibi, because there's no doubt that there's animosity at many different layers that's in power right now, given their experience over 8 years with Bibi, you know, under the Obama administration. So it'll be very, very interesting to see what plays out. We always say, hey, this is the end of Bibi, and then this masterclass politician finds a way to win. So it'll be exciting. Grab your popcorn, and, you know, in about 30, 40 days, we'll see what's what. But it's really difficult. The coalition landscape is much different than it ever was before.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would add to that, and this is also based on the assumption we do have a repeat of the previous 3 cycles that has a similar flavor, similar configuration, and therefore inevitably the same lifespan, is that, you know, for Israel's history, it has been using a very European British parliamentary system to structure a very pluralistic society. Many of its participants have no history with that form of government or that type of interaction, and therefore we may be getting to a point where the system isn't really meeting the needs of the population of the society. And, you know, obviously you can apply that in many different directions, but just even as far as how the Knesset functions and how it is formed, this may be an opportunity to look forward to what comes next in terms of adapting. You know, Israel is the startup nation. We like to promote its startup bona fides, its adaptability. Sorry, I can't say that word very frequently. But when it comes to a lot of the bureaucracy and structure of Israel, it is as slow, rigid, and uncompromising as you can possibly imagine. Therefore, there may be the need and certainly the opportunity to look into better ways of how to put together, and not only put together, but maintain a government that is serving many different populations with many different interests and very different outlooks of what the state should look like and how it should serve them. So that's what I'll leave as far as food for thought.
And we will have some further webinars, panel discussions as the elections when that draws near, and we're going to bring in some experts who can really do a deep dive on what's going on as that approaches.
Yeah, the first of which, by the way, that's currently confirmed is the day after the election. This is Wednesday, March 24th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We are going to be interviewing Dr. Sarah Yael Hirschhorn, who's an Israel Studies professor at Northwestern University. She will be breaking down sort of the results as we know them, you know, within 24 hours, but also forecasting potential coalition configuration, who's going to end up where, given the results and the information we'll have at that period. This time, this was really our agenda for Israel Update. So at this point, certainly would like to hear more from you guys if you have any thoughts, questions, certainly about anything that's been covered up to this point, but also any thoughts you have on your own, any subjects we didn't touch upon today, if you'd like to make this part of our conversation for the remainder of time we have. See a question here from Joe. Has
Interesting.
Israel been able to trace where the horrible oil spill on its coast is from, and are effective measures being taken to save marine and bird populations? I'm actually not particularly informed when it comes to what has been going on with that. I know that is going on, that it is obviously an ecological disaster that is trying to be mitigated. But, given obviously Israel's finding of natural gas on the Mediterranean coast and how it's trying to shift its energy policy, certainly away from oil to, and also not foreign sources, but also to domestic ones. This is kind of part of the package, is you are going to get more environmental issues and certainly these types of disasters going on. And I certainly hope, as much as the next person, that this is being addressed as quickly and as efficiently as possible, and to avoid a future instance of it.
I saw this a few days ago, Joe. And yeah, it's concerning. In the beginning, they weren't even giving out details, source, this or that, but this looks like it's really bad. I mean, I saw a headline or an article that talked about this being the worst environmental disaster ever. And they had some sort of oil spill down in the south, in the desert, I think, a few years ago, which was a horrible, horrible tragedy. So I don't know much about it either, Joe, but that's something to watch. And it seems to be very serious. This looks to be a large environmental disaster. And again, I don't know much more about it, but it seems to be a big problem. And I think that story is going to continue to evolve.
Another question we have in the chat from Ariel Mowgli regarding settlements, Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, what makes them illegal, and are there different rules for illegal Arab settlements being built versus illegal Jewish settlements, and how does that work? So I can offer my views on it, but Ron, I wanted you to start off.
Okay, I mean, listen, is Malaya Dumim and Ariel and Ramat Rachel, Ramat Shlomo, and these places? No, these are not illegal settlements. The whole illegal settlement argument comes from, the Geneva Conventions. And when you look at it, we have to understand fact and reality. When it comes to Israel, feelings tend to become fact in reality. Israel came into possession of the West Bank by defeating Jordan, the sovereign country of Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom. They stole the entire territory from the Palestinians in the 48 war. They occupied it for 20 years. Against better judgment, they handed over control to the Egyptians in the 6-Day War. The Egyptians foolishly started a conflict with Israel. Israel was not even prepared or had a battle plan to engage in Judea and Samaria. But because of this initiation of conflict from the Egyptian and the Jordanians, she took it in a day. And again, to be clear, took the territory from the Jordanians, who I believe in 1988 relinquished all territorial claim. So this whole argument that, occupied land and all the legalities that come along with it don't apply. If Palestine was an actual state and Israel went to war, invaded and took it over, then yeah, a lot of the stuff we hear would be true, but that never happened. If there ever is a Palestine, it will be the first time ever in history that there is a Palestinian state or a Palestine in the way that the world views it today. So when you are talking about, are they illegal? No. Are there issues there? Yes. But again, Ariel, to answer your question, are the 5 settlement blocks illegal? No. And as anyone who has any kind of IQ on this issue understands, Israel is never, and the Palestinians know this, and Arafat knows this, and Abu Mazen knows this, even European Union diplomats know this. Israel is not pulling out of the 5 blocks. It's just not going to happen. Even Obama understood that. So no, these are not illegal settlements. The only ones that you could maybe qualify as illegal, that Israel's actual court qualifies as illegal, are, some of these, you get some of these hardcore religious dudes who, get these trailers on mountaintops and cause problems. We can make an argument that they're not illegal, but those are the only ones that even Israel considers illegal, and I personally believe can be problematic. But I'm assuming you're referring to not the settlements, but the cities that exist where 500,000 Israelis, Jews live. No, they are not illegal.
Ron, to touch upon the last point that you made, and to kind of bring this out a little more broadly, conversations about legality, first and foremost, need to be dependent and are always ideologically driven by the source of authority that you're appealing to, right? Even we know this in the United States. Some states in the US have legalized the recreational use of cannabis, some have not. The federal government obviously has not. If you're going to look even historically, everything that the Nazis started to do to the Jews in terms of persecution was legal under the Third Reich. So what I'm kind of getting at here is that the use of legality as an answer to moral problems, or certainly what we want as a framework to resolve conflicts or situations, first and foremost depends on the authority that you appeal to. Israel has a very definition of what a settlement is than what the UN does, than what a particular US administration does. So it really all depends first and foremost whose definition and which source of authority you are appealing to. But also, like we just said, terminology, that for some people, all of Palestine, all of Israel from the river to the sea is a settlement.
Tel Aviv is an illegal. And that,
Right.
Ariel, you bring up a good point, which nobody ever talks about, because again, of the double standard, and we're not dealing with Jews. If there are no Jews, it is not news. That the Arabs are building illegally all over the place. This is an indisputable fact. I feel like the Israelis almost don't even care about it, but there are groups that monitor it, that are concerned about it. You brought it up in your comment. We're not going to do a deep dive on that here, but you brought up a good point. We only look at Jewish settlements, but the Arabs are building illegally all over the place. But it's, it could just, no one really cares about it, Israel included.
Right, and certainly given the situation on the ground, the status quo that was given to us by the Oslo Accords, it created a situation in which the Palestinians are in control of areas A and B exclusively on a civilian level. Security is shared in B, and Israel has C. And with that comes the respective authority or permission of both those governments to issue building permits in those areas. Now, some of those governments don't want to deal with that for whatever reason. And obviously people on the ground, for either ideological or purely bureaucratic and logistical reasons, also don't want to deal with it, whether you're talking about Jews or Arabs. So it's part of a larger conversation, certainly about the conflict, certainly how we've arrived at this point. But when it comes to the legality or illegality of places, I try not to spend so much time in those arguments, because at the end of the day, depending on the source you're appealing to, you can have a legal response or an illegal response. And to Ron's point, as far as the Fourth Geneva Convention, that's specifically focused on a occupying force forcibly moving its own population to the occupied territory. Whether you want to refer to the West Bank as occupied or not, that's not really the point here. The point is every single Israeli civilian who is living in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank is doing it because they want to. The IDF is not pushing them there. The Israeli government is not pushing them there. It certainly does not qualify it based on how that statute was written. By the way, we're talking now 60, 70 years ago. So a lot of the laws even that we're dealing with as it pertains to whether it's international law or even for laws in different countries are not exactly designed to address the current issues on the ground and the current conversations going on. All right, so I want to see if we have any more questions here. I see Joe has one more question. I'm actually not familiar with this individual, and I apologize that I can't offer any more light on your question on that.
Gila Gamliel. No. But Joe, on a side note, you can reach out to me. My cousin who I'm close with is involved. He works for the government when it comes to cleaning environmental disasters. He was involved in the Negev thing. He's involved in helping clean out all the IDF bases that are abandoned to develop for the different communities in Israel. I'd be happy to have a conversation offline and I could reach out to him, but there's no doubt he's involved at a very high level dealing with this environmental disaster.
I just wanted to, Gila Gamliel, I believe is an MK, and I think she's very, very involved in environmental issues. And of course, that's something close to my heart. That's not the only reason I would support somebody. I mean, there are other issues that I have to know about her also. So I will look into her. If anybody hears anything, Ron knows how to reach me.
I sure do.
Everybody have a wonderful, Freilich, and beautiful Purim. And thank you for this call.
All right, all the best, Joe.
Sure thing. Thank you, Joe. Here, we have one more question. I think this is a great way to close out the session today. And we started talking about this in the beginning, but due to not only the controversy surrounding it, but what type of a divisive issue it's become, depending on where you're coming from politically, ideologically, demographically. Rebecca's asking if one of us or anyone here can clarify if we think that the Michael Che SNL skit was anti-Semitism.
I'll just make a comment or two. I'll be brief. I think as a community, as Jews, we overreact to everything, and some things we need to act to, and some things we need to let go. And I'm not saying we need to let this go, but in general, anything that's ever said, and sometimes it's completely innocent or even coming from a good place, and we just lose, we lose our you-know-what, and we go crazy and mobilize. I didn't like the joke. I'm assuming he was referring to the Palestinians, but I've talked to a lot of people and I'm not so sure. And I haven't found anything. Like, I had somebody tell me that they were convinced the joke was because, for people who maybe married a non-Jew, you have a Jewish dad or non-Jewish mom or whatever, which half is Jewish? Someone told me that. I was like, I hadn't heard that, but maybe. Someone else told me something. And so I've heard of different permutations of it being just a funny joke that has nothing to do with Palestinians or anti-Semitism. I don't know. Until I see something from Michael Che, I don't want to assume he meant this. It was a slight at Israel because of what's going on in the West Bank. That's what I initially assumed. We really don't know. And if he has come out, I'd actually like someone to send that to me to see where, in his own words, what was going on with that joke. I mean, if it was pointed at the Palestinians, I still don't see it as anti-Semitism. I don't think he's an anti-Semite. I would argue that he's an idiot. If you really care about the Palestinians getting vaccinated, we've beat it to death almost on the call today. Like, whose door you need to knock on. And that door is not in the sovereign state of Israel.
Yeah, Ron, very much to your point. I think, I'm not going to assume what was in this guy's heart, what's in this guy's head. I don't want to make that type of judgment evaluation, certainly based on something that could be interpreted in different ways. The fact that, and what I think to be more informative, is the way you see people are reacting to it, different groups reacting to it. Some are focusing exclusively on the Palestinian factor. Some are focusing exclusively on non-Jewish citizens of Israel. Some are focusing just on Jews in general. Everyone is digesting and interpreting and reacting to this in their own way as they're listening to it, without actually knowing what was the person who made the statement, what was actually intended. And for me personally, I think that's more informative and certainly a larger and more important conversation to have, just to see how everyone is reacting to this in their own way and how much that informs us over what is on people's minds, certainly what their priorities are, and certainly what they are reacting to. So I would leave it at that as well.
If I could jump in for 1 second, I think the bigger issue with what was said is not whether it was anti-Semitic or whether he is, because I think he was just making a joke, but rather the issue is that it opens up a can of worms in terms of people's perceptions and how the general public may be interpreting. And I think the overt reaction is a result of being concerned that it's putting fuel on the anti-Semitism fire. And from that perspective, we need to, as a community, we should be looking at how to kind of curtail that in a more broad and general sense, proactively rather than reactively. Exactly how that looks or what that looks like, I haven't gotten to in my head.
Yeah, very true. And Jeremy, to really,
as always,
Ron,
well said, Jeremy.
We are very much our own worst enemy to this. We have a lesson in Fuel for Truth in our boot camp class when we talk about BDS. And one of the things that we do talk about is how most people know about BDS, not because they learned about it from people who endorse BDS, but because of Jews, because of Israel. We really promote the things that are not so favorable to us far better than those who are actually endorsing this. And I think something like this is no different in a lot of ways.